Mizuru is a small island lost in the endless waters of the ocean. Peace reigned here for centuries. The inhabitants fished, grew rice, celebrated traditional festivals, and lived in harmony with nature. Their life was simple but measured, and no one expected that one day everything would change. The first warning sign went unnoticed. A farmer named Taro discovered that several chickens from his yard had disappeared. He did not pay much attention to it and decided that it was the work of wild cats. However, soon children began to disappear, and then entire flocks of sheep. At night, the inhabitants heard terrifying noises, howling, growling, and rustling in the bushes. No one knew what it was, but everyone sensed the impending threat. Everything changed when the fishermen, returning from their morning fishing, reported seeing strange animals near the river, thin, with long legs and piercing eyes. Their silhouettes moved in the darkness, and there were many of them. They were jackals. Where did they come from? The island was far from the mainland, and no one could imagine that jackals could get there. Later, it was discovered that they had been accidentally brought on one of the cargo ships that had arrived with supplies. They disembarked from the ship, found shelter in the woods, and began to multiply rapidly. At first, the inhabitants tried to fight them. They set traps, lit bonfires at night, and guarded their livestock. But the jackals turned out to be smarter. They attacked unexpectedly, worked in groups, and, most importantly, were not afraid of people. Their numbers grew at an alarming rate, and soon they became a real plague. Council of Elders. In the center of the island, there was an ancient temple where the elders met when some trouble occurred. This time the meeting was especially important. The fate of the island was at stake. 7 elders sat around a round wooden table. Chief among them is Haru, a man who has lived for 90 years and whose eyes have seen more than anyone could imagine. He listened intently as the villagers complained about their missing livestock, their ruined fields, and the fear that had settled in their hearts. "We have to do something," said Farmer Ryu, a strong man whose hands were used to holding a hoe instead of a gun. "These creatures took almost all of my herd. We've already tried traps, but they don't work," added Fisherman Ken. "Jackals are more cunning than we thought." The elders were silent for a long time. Then Haru, leaning on his cane, stood up. "There is a balance in everything in nature," he said. "If there is a predator, there is someone who will stop it. But who?" Voices were heard. Haru smiled. "Dogs." The hall filled with whispers. The idea was unusual, but it made sense. Dogs are protectors by nature. They hunt, they watch, and they can resist jackals. No one could come up with a better solution. After long discussions, the decision was made. The island sent a request to the mainland. They needed dogs. Lots of dogs. Landing of dogs. 3 weeks passed before a reply came from the mainland. A large ship arrived in port, and new defenders of the island landed, 100 dogs of different breeds. Among them were large Alabai, elegant greyhounds, hardy huskies, and even several mastiffs. These dogs were trained by hunters and shepherds, and they had one purpose: to protect their new home. The residents welcomed them with joy. Children happily stroked their thick fur, and the elderly looked at them with respect. But the dogs were not just pets. They sensed danger and immediately began to explore the new territory. Haru watched their behavior and smiled. He knew they would soon show themselves. The first confrontation occurred on the first night. A pack of jackals decided to attack the village, but they were met by a pack of dogs, led by a huge Alabai named Grum. He stood in front of the jackals, growled, and rushed to attack. The rest of the dogs followed him. The next morning, people found several jackal carcasses at the edge of the forest. This was the first victory. First clashes. The jackals quickly realized that they now had an enemy. They became more cautious and attacked the village less often. But the dogs were not going to retreat. Each breed found its role. Greyhounds combed the territory. Huskies tracked the enemy. Mastiffs and Alabai became a living shield between jackals and people. They worked as a team, following ancient instincts. Grom stood out especially. He was a true leader among dogs. When the jackals tried to get into the almshouses, he was forced to leave. As the dogs were growing, Thunder stood in their way. He knew that he was protecting not only people, but the entire island. That night he got into a fight with the leader of the jackals. He was an old and experienced beast, accustomed to victories. They circled around each other, growled, and made lightning-fast attacks. The fight was long, but Grom prevailed. The jackals retreated. This was a turning point. From that day on, the jackals began to avoid places where there were dogs. The turning point. Months passed. The dogs became completely accustomed to it, and the jackals began to disappear. People were no longer afraid to go out at night, and the flocks grazed safely again. Residents fed the dogs, built shelters for them, and some even took them into their homes. But the most surprising thing is that a special connection has developed between people and dogs. They were bigger and they were just protectors. They became friends. Children played with them, fishermen took them on their boats, farmers allowed them to sleep next to their sheep. Once the island was on the brink of destruction, but now it has become a place where man and dog lived in harmony. The jackals had almost disappeared, and no one doubted that the island would never be the same again. But this was only the first part of the story. After all, new challenges awaited the dogs, and their role in the life of the island was only just beginning. The last predators. It has been a year since the first dogs arrived on the island, and they have done an incredible job. Almost all the jackals have disappeared, but the few individuals that remained were still a threat, although their numbers were rapidly decreasing. They went into the forest and into the thicket, where few could find them, but the dogs were persistent and continued their work. People did not sit idly by. They helped the dogs, built additional shelters, and even set up camps in more remote areas of the island to prevent the jackals from returning. Hunting the remaining predators was not easy, but the dogs, with the support of the people, succeeded. During this period, Grom and his descendants became symbols that it is possible to overcome any difficulties with loyalty and determination. Thunder, although growing older, was still the leader among the dogs, and his presence, regardless of his age, gave confidence to the islanders. Sometimes people gathered around campfires and told stories of how Thunder had defeated the leader of the jackals as he led his pack deep into the village. This story inspired and gave strength to all who worked in the fields, fished, or defended their homes. By the end of the second year, there were almost no jackals left. There were only isolated cases when their howling could be heard at night in the most remote corners of the island. But even at such times, Grom and his descendants did not lose their vigilance. The dogs began to explore new territories, expanding their patrols. In the forests, on the coasts, and in other places on the island, they became more and more agile, intelligent, and united. By then, the islanders no longer had any doubts. The dogs had become an integral part of them. The mutual understanding between people and animals became so deep that with each passing day this union became not only functional, but also emotional. New owners. Once the island was freed from the jackal threat, the dogs began to feel more secure. But unexpectedly for many, they did not leave the island. On the contrary, they strengthened their positions, and each of them became part of the new life on Mizuru. The islanders began to realize that these dogs were not only protectors, but also true companions in their daily life. Fishermen who had previously gone out to sea alone now always took their dogs with them on their boats, not only for protection, but also to help catch fish. The dogs learned to recognize fish, help pull the net to shore, and even use their keen sense of smell to find the most profitable places to fish. However, even on land, dogs became faithful companions. Farmers, who tended their crops, allowed their pets to protect the fields from other animals that might interfere with the harvest. The appearance of dogs in the fields was a real game changer. People began to notice how easy it was to harvest. Dogs chased away all wild animals that could harm the plants. In addition, dogs made it easier to track the herd. Not only were they able to detect predators, but they knew how to lead the pack to new pastures, avoiding dangerous areas of the island. Each inhabitant of the island found his own protector. The dogs became family members, friends who faithfully served their master and gave him a sense of security. In the villages, small celebrations began in honor of the dogs, where people thanked them for their loyalty and help. It became clear that now the dogs were the rightful owners of the island, and the people were their protectors and friends. However, among all the dogs, Grom's descendants stood out. His children and grandchildren were the true heroes of the island. Although Grom himself was already old, his descendants continued his work and became new leaders among the dogs. Grom became a legend, but his descendants continued the legend, continuing to be not only protectors, but also a symbol of how dogs became an integral part of life on the island. Thunder and his descendants. Grom, despite his venerable age, continued to be a symbol of strength and courage on the island. Everyone knew him and admired his wisdom, combined with immeasurable courage. But as the years passed, Grom spent more and more time in the shade of the trees, resting from active patrols, and his descendants gradually became the main guards of the island. His eldest sons, and later his grandsons, took his place at the front in the fight to keep the island safe. They carried the traits of their legendary ancestor, the same strength, the same determination, and the same drive to protect his people. Unlike their ancestors, Thunder's descendants also learned other important skills. They became not only protectors, but also mentors to the younger dogs. Their upbringing was special. These dogs were trained to survive in the most difficult conditions, solve problems, and work as a team. Meanwhile, the islanders, watching this process, began to respect their four-legged companions more and more. They began to collect stories about Grom and his descendants, and these stories began to be passed down from generation to generation. The islanders said, "If it weren't for Thunder, we wouldn't have been able to save this island. He is the symbol of our unity, tourists, and fame." Within a few years, the story of the island and its unusual alliance with dogs had spread far beyond local news. People from all over the country began to come to Missouri to see with their own eyes the place where dogs and people live in perfect harmony. Tourists came not only for the interesting natural landscapes, but also to witness the unique bond between the islanders and their loyal protectors. They enjoyed watching the dogs work in the fields, take part in fishing expeditions, and live with the local people. Many tourists came to the island with one goal: to see how people and animals can live in harmony. The island's fame grew, and soon local residents began to make money from tourism. They opened small hotels, conducted tours, and sold locally produced goods. But they always emphasized how important dogs are to their culture and life. Tourists not only came, but also learned from the locals. In some cases, visitors even left the island with their dogs, taking a piece of this unique history with them. People began to realize that Missouri was not just home to dogs, but that there was an entire culture where these animals had an indispensable meaning. Temple of Devotion. The fame of Grom and his descendants eventually led to the construction of the temple. It was built on a high hill, which offered a beautiful view of the island and its base. It was not just a temple, it was a place of worship for all who believed in the power of devotion and loyalty. The temple was simple in its design, but every detail was thought out with special care. In the center of the temple was a statue of the Thunderer, carved from wood. The legendary Alibi was depicted at the peak of his power, with his head raised, personifying not only strength, but also the spiritual connection between man and animal. Both tourists and local residents came to the temple to honor the memory of Grom and his descendants. Many brought gifts, pieces of fish, rice, fruit. All this became symbols of gratitude for protection and loyalty. Life in a new world. Missouri Island became a place where animals and people did not just exist side by side, but lived in complete unity. Dogs have become not only protectors, but also helpers in everyday life. In exchange for they received attention and care, which also made their lives full. For the children who grew up on the island, the dogs became loyal friends. They spent a lot of time with them, played with them, and even learned about life from them. Young children often took dogs with them into the forest to teach them to trust and understand nature. Missouri became an example of how nature and man can live in harmony. Dogs became part of the local culture, part of what shaped the future of this island. The legend continues. 20 years passed and Missouri Island prospered. It became a symbol of peace and harmony between people and animals. Everyone who came here felt like they had found their home. And although the jackals left and Grom became a legend, his spirit lived on. The story of the faithful dogs has been passed down from generation to generation. He reminded everyone that even in the most difficult times, it is possible to find unity with nature and with those who protect us. The legend of Grom and his descendants lived on in the hearts of the people, and life continued in harmony and tranquility in Missouri.